Hey guys, it's been a while.
One will be appointed for you at government expense. Hi guys. It's been a while.
I haven't really had a chance to play the game all that much in the last few months. I did, however, keep my eyes across the updates as they were coming out, and the most recent balance change really rubbed me the wrong way. And not for this change specifically, but because this is the third rebalance change I've strongly disliked. If you want a bit of an explanation why I haven't posted in a bit, check out my Discord. I gave a bit of an update there, but let's just say it's been a tough few months, and I want to say a deep thank you for everyone who supported me, even though I haven't been uploading as regularly. It means a lot. If you could like and subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. With the recent update and magic rebalance, Jagex has now worked or dramatically changed core aspects of all three combat styles in recent past. First things first, I need to establish a few key points before we begin. Firstly, we're going to look at why rebalancing was done, and what was the design intention behind it, and what it really actually did. Secondly, I'm going to establish the historic changes made at 3 key points in different times for balancing. And thirdly, I will establish the detail and the ramifications of each of those changes at those times. Then I'll conclude and wrap up exactly why I think these changes are the way they are, and where the game could be heading with these changes, and why I think that's going to be a real problem. Rebalancing. Rebalancing in games is a relatively new idea. Back in the early 2000s, once a game shipped, that was the way it was. The pistol on Halo CE was broken as anything, but there wasn't any going back and fixing it. It was there to stay. What are we talking about again? Alright, RuneScape balance. Rebalancing is a new concept where a shipped game receives an update that changes the power level of items, skills, stats, or weapons in order to make the game experience more enjoyable. For example, in League of Legends, they ship an update every 2 to 3 weeks that buffs or nerfs champions or items to try and keep the power level of the 160 plus characters roughly in line. Similarly, in Counter-Strike, they occasionally balance weapons, increase their costs, or reduce their stats or damage. For example, how much damage a weapon could do, or how many bullets can be held, as the infamous Tech 9 was nerfed for being almost a primary weapon for the cost of a pistol. Now, what do you notice about these games? They are multiplayer PvP games. The effectiveness or an overpowered nature of a weapon can give you an unfair advantage and ruin other players' experiences, because the number values on a particular item, champion, skill, weapon, etc. is just not fair. This can create a negative gameplay experience, where instead of a diverse range of weapons or champions being used, the options are slimmed down to the most powerful champions abusing a broken item or two, and forcing everyone else to either join the broken champion brigade or perish. So what does this have to do with RuneScape? RuneScape, unlike most other games, is effectively a single player MMO. The reason why Iron Man mode, for example, can exist in an MMO is almost exclusive to RuneScape. The fact that almost all content in the game, including raids and higher tier content, is soloable is incredibly unique. And for the record, I think that's a good thing. I could make a whole video about that, and I might make that at another time, but let's keep on going. To compare to another MMO, the most popular, World of Warcraft, where the highest difficulty raid, Mythic, you need the help of 19 other people of a variety of classes in order to even attempt the content. However, the main multiplayer aspect of RuneScape is the fact that there's a big economy of other players who can buy and sell items on the Grand Exchange. RuneScape, however, is very unique in that the method or speed in which you kill a boss only impacts other players in the terms of value of the loot that can be sold on the Grand Exchange. If, for example, Olm could be killed in a single hit, there would be tens of thousands more Twisted Bows entering the game, reducing their value due to supply and demand. However, would there be? Jagex actually implemented a change where introducing the GE tax that means the GE automatically buys back a Twisted Bow every time the tax amount is high enough to remove one from the game. Modash has shown on Twitter how many items they sink, and have also shown that not every item is on this list, that they manually added and removed items historically to reduce or increase the amount of items coming into the game. So why am I mentioning this? Well, we consider to be RuneScape effectively a single player game. Let's just imagine a world where Olm did have 1 HP and could be one shot, and thousands of Twisted Bows were coming into the game. right? Well, if Jagex wanted to, they could simply increase the tax amount and or increase the amount of T-bows that they sync arbitrarily. For example, they could sync a twisted bow every single time one is bought or traded on the GE. Maybe not every single time, but let's say every second. This would mean, despite the fact that thousands of Olms are being killed, just as many twisted bows are being removed from the game, and the total number of twisted bows would stay the same. This would of course naturally inject millions of extra gold into the game, but let's not cover that just this moment. We're talking about the item itself. Would this be good for the game? No, of course not, but I'm using an extreme example to illustrate the point that it's entirely up to Jagex, whatever their economics team wants to and manage to determine that amount of quantity of an item. Therefore, supply and demand of every single item in the game is effectively up to Jagex and how many of the item they want to sync and how rare they want to make the item obtainable. The Twisted Bow is currently 1.6 billion GP, not just because it is rare, but because Jagex wants it to be rare and expensive. So why would you make it rare? Why does it matter? So firstly, powerful rare epic items are cool, because it's something to strive for. For example, let's look at another MMO, World of Warcraft. You can get a brand new fresh character and gear them up by spamming Mythic Plus to be at the very least heroic raid ready, which is the second highest difficulty, within a few days. This isn't 100% accurate, especially on brand new expansion releases. You're having to level up a new character on the new content and then finding the most efficient ways to do it. You're probably going to be a bit slower. Principle is the same. Within 20 or 30 hours of a new character being made, you can have it geared up, ready to do raid level content. However, in RuneScape, it takes some Iron Men hundreds if not 1,000 raids to get their Twisted Bow, which can be upwards of 500 hours for just this one item. So in order for that grind to feel worth it, it has to be a truly epic weapon, and that means it has to be borderline overpowered. So in order to maintain the prestige and power of these epic weapons, Jagex makes sure to consistently release content where the Shadow, Scythe, and Twisted Bow are best in slot, and in the cases of the Scythe, buff the weapon until it is epic enough to justify its grind. However, on a fundamental level here, if we exclude PvP, you're not actually competing against anyone. The most competitive thing out there is high scores for total kills or speed kills, in which, if you wanted, you consider it unfair that an arbitrary amount of gold between any mid-level and high-level player stops them from even attempting to achieve that score. What do I mean by that? I mean someone with 99s in all stats and a toxic blowpipe is never going to beat someone who's got 99s in everything and a twisted bow, simply because they don't have the gold to have a chance to compete for a world record. For example, when you play a game of Counter-Strike, Valorant, or League of Legends, it's not as if certain weapons, runes, or masteries that deal more damage or have more of an impact are locked behind a massive paywall before you can use them. Also, RuneScape is a solved game. We have 100% of the equations, we know exactly how the math works at DPS for any given boss. Sure, there might be small techs or slight optimizations, but whenever we obtain the stat block of a new enemy, we can mathematically prove the best exact setup at any given time. It's not like StarCraft, Brood War, where new techs are discovered over years after the game's release, despite no patches. From 1998 through to 2007, the Protoss vs Zerg matchup was considered a Zerg favored matchup. However, Bisu played a famous match against Savior, one of the best players in the game, and Bisu upset Savior with a totally new and different build, which reinvented the meta and is now considered a Protoss-sided matchup. We can't really have these things in RuneScape. Sure, we can discover new techs and different things, but nothing fundamentally is going to make people realize, oh, there's a weapon better than the Twisted Bow for this situation. Because of this reason, I think the constant nerfs to mid-table weapons over the last 5 years has put the majority of players further out of reach of their goals and keeps them grinding on the treadmill for the rich, few at the top to benefit for the sake of game balance. To provide a disclaimer, I currently have 5 max combat accounts, 1 max main, and a total of 3.5 billion GP, and I say this as someone who's been unfairly advantaged over these years, and I think it's poor for the future of the game. To completely explain why this is the case, we first need to establish what changes were made on each of the 3 individual balance patches and what they meant for the game as a whole. Chapter 2, covering the historic prior changes. Rebalance 1, range. This all started back in February of 2021, when Jagex changed the attack requirements on a number of weapons to raise them further, as well as nerfing Black D-Hide Armor, the Din's Bulwark, and the Toxic Blowpipe. These changes were widely favored by high-level community, as their Twisted Bow's effectiveness just got stronger compared to alternative weapons, so they didn't have to use the blowpipe as much. They were also favored by PKers, as Black D-Hide nerfs meant players couldn't defend themselves in lower budget gear in the wilderness, and the Bulwark was no longer a one-item tank set, meaning that players doing non-PvP activities in the wilderness had to now bring much more loot in order to protect themselves from PKers. Firstly, let's cover the changes to the attack level requirements for weapons. These stat requirements did absolutely nothing to the actual weapons themselves. All it did was put an arbitrary extension on how much grinding at Nightmare Zone was required before you could wield them. I'm not saying level requirements are pointless, sure it doesn't make sense for a level 3 to be able to wield a god sword, but on a fundamental level the difference between someone with 75 attack holding a rapier and 80 is less than 1% change to DPS, and doesn't really make you an epic warrior wielding a godly weapon, considering you can already use a god sword at 75 attack anyway, so in lore terms arguably a more thematic and powerful weapon. The same logic applies to basically every single weapon they changed. For people who were already max players like myself, there was no change, but for more mid to later game players finally hitting their stride and getting a powerful bossing weapon, it was a slap in the face and tell them that there was another 20 hours of grinding before they could start having fun with the shiny new rapier. The biggest change, however, by a mile, was the toxic blowpipe. Now, as a max player who has 3 bill and a twisted bow at the time, I was strongly against this change. This was the most anti-mid to lower level player change I had ever seen Jagex make up until that point. Almost all their changes for mid-level players were positive. However, now your viable all-round weapon, the blowpipe, was massively reduced in effectiveness at almost all content. The justification for the level shift was to create room for new tier 75 weapons without power creeping. While some new weapons have been added, I would argue they are niche and see little to no use, and are thus not true replacements for the weapons that they nerfed in order to replace them in the first place. Now onto the big part about this rebalance, the blowpipe. The initial complaint was the blowpipe was too strong and too useful in too many places, so they nerfed it. However, currently it's still best in slot at 26 places and second best in slot at 11, and the weapon they introduced between the blowpipe and the twisted bow, the bow of Faradinin, is only best in slot at 5 and second best in slot at 29. Meanwhile, you guessed it, the T-bow is bis at 32 and top 3 at a further 8, meaning that more or less at every single place the Bofa is second best, the T-bow is bis, or the toxic blowpipe was the better option anyway. This is almost exactly the same situation as before, where the T-bow is the best and the blowpipe is bis everywhere else. Sure, things like the Zarak crossbow are good, but only really as a spec weapon, not as a primary DPS weapon. For those of you who might not have been around, back before the blowpipe you used to primarily use adamant darts, as the damage didn't really change all that much. However, since the nerfs, in order to maintain around adamant dart level damage, using the very cheap darts, you now have to buy much more expensive rune or amethyst darts. So not only the blowpipe still best in slot in most places the T-bow isn't, and therefore a plethora of other weapons that were promised to fill out the space weren't, you now have to pay a dramatically larger amount of money per hour to use the same weapon you were already using anyway. Basically, you have the blowpipe for 3 mil, the Bofa for 100 mil, and the T-bow for 1.5 bill, and then made the poorer players, who could only afford a blowpipe, now pay more per hour to use the thing. So sure, high tier players that have every single weapon, it's great to occasionally use a new weapon instead of the T-bow, but for everybody else it's pretty much a worse situation than before. You're still stuck with a blowpipe, it's just now worse and more expensive. Let's move on to rebalance number 2. I've already covered the arbitrary level requirement changes for attack weapons in the last section, so I won't really cover that here, but these changes are actually split into 2 different rebalance changes regarding melee weapons. Mostly the Fang and the Scythe as the primarily mid to late game weapons. Firstly, on the 31st of October 2022, they hotfixed the Fang so it doesn't reroll both accuracy and defense. This was a pretty substantial nerf to the weapon, however it still left it in a pretty strong state. So strong that they nerfed it again in January of this year. So the slash bonus was no longer any good. This obviously killed it as a slash weapon and left it as stab only. This was a budget friendly weapon to the Scythe akin to the blowpipe versus twisted bow, although the Fang cost a bit more. The gap between the Fang and the Scythe was very close. So close in fact that at a number of pieces of content the Fang was actually better for GP per hour because you didn't have to pay for the charges on the Scythe. For the record, I do think the Scythe was too costly to use, but that's a discussion for another time. However, the Scythe was still predominantly the best weapon and used in any speed records or for the fastest kills per hour. The price gap between the two weapons was also vastly smaller, with the Fang being around 30 to 40 mil and the Scythe being around 400 to 500 mil, compared to the 3 mil and 1 bill of the blowpipe and T-bow at the time. The intention to nerf the Fang and buff the Scythe was to make the Scythe more competitive, but let me ask, why? Why did the Scythe have to be more competitive? Is it because TOB had to be relevant content? But if that's the case, why didn't we buff Inquisitors, the content that's dead and unusable and is also melee? Or shouldn't we buff the Rapier, that's also a TOB weapon, that isn't as strong as it used to be, and could be another single-handed melee weapon instead of the Fang? But instead, they decided to nerf the cheap weapon and in this case buff the more expensive weapon. Once again meaning that anyone who already had hundreds of millions of GP could pick up the Scythe as a new best weapon, and anyone with a Fang, again like the blowpipe, was now stuck with the same weapon they were already limited to using anyway, it's just worse now. Finally, we move on to the most recent rebalance, for Mage. Firstly, the cheap necklace item, the Occult, is being nerfed substantially from 10% magic damage down to 4%, and that is being given out to each of the pieces of Ancestral, and they're also throwing an extra 4% onto Augury. This again is great if you're already super rich with max Mage, Shadow, and full Ancestral, but nerfed if you're a poor player who can only afford ARAMs. They claim this is to bring the occult in lines with its obtainability. However, the occult has a similar impact on DPS, not including the shadow, in its current state as the Amulet of Torture does, and the Amulet of Torture can be obtained from demonic gorillas, right? This effectively means that you're locked behind 69 Slayer, nice, in order to obtain an Amulet of Torture after completing Monkey Madness 2 from demonic gorillas. However, the occult is locked behind 93 Slayer, so technically bigger grind, harder to obtain, right? So despite nerfing the occult, and it's because, and I quote, these changes are to bring the necklace's power a little bit more in line with its obtainability. It's actually more difficult to obtain than either of the other two best in slot necklaces anyway. Clearly this means that Jagex entirely balances their items based on the gold value that they are worth, not how difficult they actually are to obtain in world. So once again, if you're already a rich player, you just watch your ancestral set go up another 100 mil and you get a need 4% damage boost on top of what you already had. Meanwhile, if you're poor and can only afford ARAMs, eat dirt, I guess. I will say since recording, Jagex has announced they're going to make some changes, but I still don't think these fully address the issue. Yes, they made ARAMs have a bit more magic damage, however you're still worse off than you were before with just the occult, and they also don't touch on how this completely ruins your flexibility with gear setups. Now, if you want to deal magic damage, you have to bring full ARAM switches everywhere. You can't just use the occult with the Slayer Helm to get maxed of effectiveness, or an occult with the Void Mage setup as a budget setup at Zorba, for example. Or at Barrows, for example, where you just want to bring an occult necklace switch, not a full ARAM switch, as the brothers have zero magic defense anyway. Again, this has no impact on max mage players who are already wearing 100% max mage gear to buff their shadow. But outside of the shadow, magic is already one of the weakest attack styles of the three, and they just made it even harder for less wealthy players to use. This was also a perfectly good opportunity to give something like the Eternal Boots some loves, perhaps make Eternal Boots plus Occult equal your old magic bonus, as boots tend not to clash with other gear setups too badly in terms of negative bonus, set bonuses, or weight. For example, you can still wear Eternal Boots while wearing Void. Now let's review. What is the primary through line of these rebalances Jagex claimed were done to provide more diversity of weapons or balance the game and not overcrowd tiers? However, I see one major through line between every single one of these changes. If you're rich, you get benefits. If you're poor, we don't care about you. They serve to increase the gap between the poor and rich, and if you've had max gear this whole time, these changes are great for you. They make your weapons stronger, they make your gear you already have cost even more so your bank value goes up further, and they make the raids and other content you already do more efficiently than lower level players, give you more GP per hour, so you can spend even more of that money buying endgame gear or bonds and fund your membership forever. A cynical person might say they're making these gaps bigger intentionally so that they can incentivize players to spend real world money on bonds to attempt to bridge said gap. Sure, a newer player could theoretically grind for hundreds of hours in crap gear before they finally afford Ancestral, or they could potentially just drop $300 on bonds and buy that Ancestral right now. Your first thought might be, there's no way people are doing that. But trust me, I have plenty of industry information and you would just be shocked at how many people spend on microtransactions, especially when there is a substantial and meaningful way you can buy power and advantage in a game like RuneScape. There are certainly people who will do it, and if you want a good example, check out YouTuber Josh Hayes, who breaks this down. In one of his videos, he talks about a person who was spending $1,000 a week on a mobile game because that was cheaper than going out with their friends drinking on the town on a Friday. There are players who will spend astronomically more money than you think to buy advantage in games, especially single player games like RuneScape effectively is. I feel like many of the justifications from players, especially higher level players, are that these changes are good and make epic items hold their value better, but my questions to them would be, firstly, why does the value of the weapon matter? If the Twisted Bow was 1 GP, it would still be an amazing weapon. It would just mean everyone got to compete on the same playing field. To make another extreme example, could they similarly add in a weapon so rare that it costs 1 trillion GP and only 1 or 2 people in the entire game would be able to own it, and it could be a Twisted Bow with double all the stats? Would that be better for the game because there was a legendary ultra rare weapon? Secondly, why does the balance of the game matter so dramatically that we have to nerf weaker players and make it even harder for them to get into PvM in the first place? A player who's going from Vorkarth into COX already has a dramatic skill floor to climb before they can even get their first solo raid completion. Or even a trio, but like I said, realistically, RuneScape is a solo player game. Many people are going to try and solo it. Yet we want to make them deal even less damage and make it even less likely that a more experienced player will bring them along because they're going to be harder to carry, despite their small budget. So instead, with changes like these, we tell them, go back and grind Vorkath for another 40 hours before you come back and raid with us. At the point I made earlier, you can have a brand new leveled character up and ready to raid with your friends in the second highest difficulty in less than 40 hours in World of Warcraft. So why do we create such an immense barrier for entry for newer players? If I told my friend today, hey, you should come play RuneScape with me, TOB is a really cool raid, it's going to take them hundreds of hours to level up their account and stats and grind enough gold before they'll be able to have the correct stats, gear, and quest completion in order to be able to do a raid with me. Now, I'm not saying we should hand out everything for free, and I'm certainly not saying that the Twisted Bow, Shadow, and Scythe should be made vastly easier to obtain, but what I am saying is increasing the gap between newer players and the experienced veterans is only going to create an even deeper divide and alienation for newer players. And this game needs newer players to survive. The game has been growing year on year, but there are plenty of players who get turned away by our outdated graphics and difficulty and length of grind. As someone who's already completed many of these grinds, including maxing, this isn't a big deal. But for people who are just getting into the game and with an aging player base, we need to find new ways to get players into the game, and we need to make it fun for them to play. And I don't think increasing the divide between the poor and the wealthy is going to be a good way to do that. Found something in this video interesting? Consider leaving a like, comment, and subscribing. Another massive thank you to my supporters on Patreon who keep this channel alive and allow me to put maximum effort into each and every video. You can support from as little as $2 a month, and thank you to the rest of my Patreons of all tiers. I suggest checking out the Discord, as I'll be doing future episodes of Setup Surgeon. If you want your setup analyzed, go check out the Discord channel, check out the video description for links to the Patreon, Twitch, Twitter, and Discord, and I hope something in this video helped you reach your next level.